Hi everyone and welcome to chapter 7. In this chapter we are going to discuss about swaps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain all the concepts on an Excel sheet and then we'll visit the slides per PowerPoint and try to cover them. So let's go to the Excel sheet first. So what is a swap? Swap is effectively exchange of cash flows. So you have some cash flows, you're exchanging it with the other party. So it's an exchange. Swap is an exchange. So there are different types of swaps, but the most common swap is an interest rate swap. So what is an interest rate swap? Interest rate swap is a swap whereby you are exchanging a fixed interest rate for a floating one. You are exchanging a fixed interest rate for a floating one, or the other way around. You are changing from floating to fixed or fixed to floating. So once again, an interest rate swap is where you are exchanging, it's an exchange between fixed and floating. Okay. So let's understand it a little bit more. So there are different ways to do an interest rate swap. So it can be used for converting an asset or it can be used to convert a liability. So let's see how it can be used to convert an asset. So in this thing, we are going to exchange fixed for floating. So let's say there are two banks, Royal Bank of Canada, RBC and TD. Now RBC has a lot of loans, TD has a lot of loans also. Now these loans are income generating assets for banks. So banks are going to be paid on those loans. So people are taking loans from RBC, people are taking loans from TD. So these are assets for the banks and people are going to pay RBC and people are going to pay TD. Now let's say RBC is getting floating interest rate on its assets. So whatever loan asset it has, people are mostly paying floating interest rate on that obligations. TD is getting a fixed interest rate on its obligation. So TD is people are paying at a fixed price. Now RBC wants to convert their assets into a fixed interest generating asset. So it is getting floating, people are paying floating interest, but it wants to convert that asset into a fixed one. So instead of getting floating, it should get fixed. And TD wants to convert its asset into a floating one. Instead of getting fixed rate that it is getting right now, it wants to convert it into a floating rate. So how do they do that? They do a swap with each other. Now swaps can be done through a third party financial institution or it can be done bilaterally. So let us assume for simplicity purpose that it is a bilateral swap. So RBC and TD are getting into a bilateral swap with each other. So how would they convert it? RBC wants to get a fixed interest rate by converting whatever floating interest it gets. So how will it do it? RBC will get into a contract whereby it plays floating. So it pays floating rates into the swap to the other party and it receives fixed from the swap. So it pays floating rate to the other party and from the other party it receives fixed rate. So what it is effectively doing, customers of RBC are paying floating rate to RBC. It is taking that floating rate and giving it into swap. And it is taking a fixed rate from swap. So effectively it is paying floating rate and it is receiving fixed rate from a swap transaction. TD on the other hand gets fixed rate from customers. So it is taking that fixed rate, paying it into swap and getting floating rate from swap. So RBC once again plays floating rate, receives fixed, TD pays fixed, receives floating. So this is a swap transaction. Effectively, RBC, who had assets that were playing floating, converted its assets into a fixed rate asset. TD, whose assets were paying fixed, converted it into floating rate assets. So let's see how that will work. Let's say it's a 5-year swap. It's a 5-year swap transaction and Floating rate we are considering is LIBOR plus spread. So that is how it works. So generally banks have an obligation to pay into swap LIBOR plus some interest rate, some spread. Okay, there is a concept of netting. So both parties don't pay the whole amount. Whichever party is making money pays the other party. So there is a concept of netting, which we are going to discuss. For this example, we are assuming fixed rate is 5%, floating rate is whatever LIBOR is going on. LIBOR is the floating rate. Whatever LIBOR is going on in the market plus 1%. So spread is 1%. Notional capital is 1 million. So what will happen to RBC and what will happen to TD? So let's construct the payout cycle of this swap based on these values of LIBOR for RBC and for TD. So what is RBC doing? RBC is going to pay floating and receive fixed. So let's first calculate how much fixed interest rate it is going to receive every year. We are assuming annual compounding for simplicity. So every year it is going to get 5%. It is on a notional principal of $1 million. Okay. So $50,000 it's going to receive from the swap. Each year it's going to receive a fixed value of 50,000. Now how much it pays depends on LIBOR. So floating rate for this example is LIBOR plus 1%. So RBC is going to pay LIBOR plus 1% that's going on, that's there in the market. So if you do it, so LIBOR, whatever given rate, plus 1% into 1 million, that is the principal. So in first year LIBOR is 4%, so RBC is going to pay 4% LIBOR plus spread 1% into 1 million. So it's going to pay 50,000, it's going to receive 50,000. So net there is no cash flow from the swap. There is no cash flow from the swap. Second year it is going to get 50,000, that is fixed. How much it is going to pay? 5%. Okay. Plus 1% spread into 1 million. So it's going to pay 60, receive 50. So net payment would be 10 grand. So effectively RBC is going to pay $10,000 into the swap, right? If it is 3%, it's going to receive again 50,000 in the third year. It's going to pay 3% plus 1% into 1 million, 40,000. I'll just scroll it down. So net payments are 1050. So if value is negative, you pay. If value is positive, you get. So RBC, who is going to receive fixed and pay floating, first year nothing happens in the swap. Second year the swap, RBC has to pay into the swap 10 grand. Then in the year 3 it gets paid 10 grand. Then in year 5 it gets paid 5 grand. And in final year nothing happens from the swap. So this is how netting is done, and these are cash flows from the swap. These are cash flows from the swap. Same way, let's do it for TD. Now TD does the opposite thing. It pays fixed and receives floating. So how much does it pay? It pays 5% every year on a notional principal of 1 million. So it pays $50,000. So let's have a negative sign because it's paying it 50,000 each year. Okay. And there should be a negative sign for even this. The reason you're paying. So payments are negative. Okay. The conversation doesn't change. I'm just making it so that it's little easy to understand because I'll share this Excel file later on. That's why it was not happening. Okay, same thing, just I'm changing the signs. So it pays 50 grand, right, fixed. It receives floating. So how much it is going to receive? In first year it's going to get 4% plus 1% spread that was there in the swap into 1 million, 50 grand. Next year it's going to get 60, 40, 45 and 50. So receives floating, pays fixed, so net 0, 10, minus 10 and 5. So if you see, it's exact opposite to cash flows of RBC. So RBC in the third year receives 10 grand, TD in the third year pays 10 grand. So swaps, they're swapping cash flows. So this is how a swap works. Both get into a transaction where they will exchange cash flows, netting is done, and whatever is the result from the netting, that is shared. Okay, so this was converting an asset, converting something that pays you from fixed to floating. Now there could be a swap to convert an liability. So what does that mean? So assume there are two companies, Amazon and Walmart. Now Amazon has borrowings at fixed rate. So it has taken some loans from the market at fixed rate. It has maybe borrowed on bonds. So Amazon has to pay a fixed rate of return to its borrowers, to people who it has borrowed from, right? Walmart has a borrowing at floating rate, so it has to pay floating rate of return. Okay, Amazon wants to convert its liability into floating rate. Walmart wants to convert its liability into a fixed rate obligation. So how could they do that? So they will also get into a swap obligation. Now Amazon wants to convert its liability from fixed to floating. So what will it do? It will get into a swap transaction by paying floating rate, okay, which it wants to do, and receive fixed rate. So it will get into a swap transaction where it pays floating into the swap and receives fixed from the swap. Now whatever it gets from the swap, it pays it on its loans. So effectively it is nullifying the loan and paying a floating rate to do that. So it is converting its fixed rate obligation into a floating rate obligation. Same way, Walmart will pay fixed into the swap and receive a floating rate. So whatever it receives from the swap, it will pay that on the borrowing. So effectively it is nullifying that obligation. So Amazon is getting converting its liability from a fixed rate liability to a floating rate one. Walmart is converting its liability from a floating rate one to a fixed rate one. Now let us assume they are not doing a bilateral agreement, they are going through a financial institution. So they are doing a swap agreement using, let's say, Bank of America. So these financial institutions generally work on spreads. So they will charge different rates to Amazon and Walmart, and the difference between those rates would be its spread. Okay, so let's completely understand this example by taking some numbers. So notional principal is 5 million. So I'll just now write it down. Okay, notional principal is $5 million. Fixed rate is 4%. Floating rate is whatever LIBOR goes on in the market plus 2%. Payments happen every 6 months. So 6 months, so rate is decided at the start of 6 months. Payment happens at the end of 6 months. Okay. Duration of the swap agreement is 3 years. So this is the duration, start of 0, start of first 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years, 2.5 years, and start of third year. Okay. Now let's see how this will work for Amazon and for Walmart. So I'll bring them closer. Okay. So let's do it for Amazon first, then we'll do it for Walmart and calculate the net flows from swap to Amazon and for Walmart. So first of all, Amazon pays floating and receives fixed. So let's calculate the fixed interest rate for Amazon that it is going to receive. So that would be fixed rate of return is 4%. Divide by 2. Why divide by 2? Because we are paying every 6 months. So 4% is the annual rate. We are dividing it by 2, right? Multiplied by notional principal 5 million. So every 6 months it is going to receive $100,000 from this swap contract. Every 6 months it's going to receive $100,000 from swap contract. Now in this swap it pays floating rate. So what is the floating rate? So LIBOR, I'll convert this into percentages so that it's a little easier. Okay, so these are the LIBOR projections, LIBOR forwards. So forward rate is the expected rate in the future. So these are the projections. Let's say these projections come true. So it's going to receive floating rate from it's going to pay floating rate into the swap. It's going to receive fixed and pay floating. So how much will be the payments for Amazon? So it is 2%, whatever interest rate is there, LIBOR, plus the spread is 2% again, divided by 2 multiplied by 5 million. So 100,000 in first year. Second, 2.2 years plus spread 2% divide by 2 multiplied by notional principal 5 million. So same way you will calculate for all these things. This has to be constant so that I can drag it. So same way you have to calculate for all these timelines. Okay, so net payment for Amazon, whatever it receives minus whatever it pays. So first year 0, next few years it's like first, right now at the start of the swap 0, 6 months from now it pays 5,000, then it pays 7,500, then it pays 2,500, then it receives 5 grand, then it pays pays 5 grand, then it pays 0. Okay, let's see for Walmart. Now for Walmart it will be different. It pays fixed and receives floating. So how to calculate fixed rate? 4% is the fixed rate, divide by 2 into 5 million. So it's going to pay $100,000 every 6 months for the next 3 years. And it's going to receive floating. So how much floating it's going to receive? Received amount will be 2% plus spread 2% divide by 2 into 5 million. Okay, so 100,000 in year 1, whatever is the cash flow in year 2, 3, so on, and it receives floating minus it pays fixed. So cash flow for Walmart, 5,000 it receives, 7.5 it receives, 2.5 it receives, then it pays 5 grand, then it receives 5 grand, and finally last year it neither pays anything nor receives anything. Okay, so this is how you can convert a liability by using swaps. You can exchange interest rates. You can convert assets by using swaps. Okay, swap will only pay what is the netted amount. It doesn't pay what is the, it doesn't actually make these payments. It just pays the netted amount. Now, next concept is valuation of swap. So how do you do valuation of swaps? For valuing swaps, you calculate present value of netted amounts. You calculate present value of netted amounts using risk-free rates. You calculate present value of netted amounts using risk-free rate. So we did this example. So let's calculate value of this swap. Let's calculate value of this swap. So the RBC one. So this was the swap, this was the netted amount, right? To value any swap, you need risk-free rate. We generally use OIS rate. LIBOR is used to calculate net cash flows from the swap, but OIS rate is used to discount those cash flows. So let's say OIS rate is 3%, the risk-free rate, 3% for year 1, 3.2% for year 2, 3.5% for year 3, 4% for year 5, and 4.2% for year 5. Okay, these are the OIS risk-free rates that are given to you. Okay, so how do you find present value? So to find present value, we use continuous compounding. So formula is netted amount multiplied by exponential negative sign interest rate times number of years. So once again, I'll write it down too. So the formula is netted amount multiplied by exponential negative sign interest rate into time. Exponential interest rates into time. So if you do that, it will be 10 grand netted amount multiplied by exponential negative sign interest rates times time. Same way, exponential netted amount times exponential interest rate negative sign discounting interest rate times time. I'm just dragging it. So value of swap will be addition of all these present values. So 3883 would be value of swap. So once again, value of swap is always present value of netted amount at risk-free rate. That is generally OIS rate. So let us calculate value of this swap. Let's do it for Walmart. It's one and the same thing. Okay. Okay, this was the netted amount for the Amazon Walmart one. So we need to find present value. So let's say we need OIS rate, risk-free rate to do that. So risk-free rate is, let's say, 2%, 2.1%, 3%, 3.2%, 1%, sorry, 3.3%, 3.35%, and 3.5%. So these are the netted amounts. These are the risk-free rates: 2%, 2.5%, 2.1%, 3, 3.2, 3.3, 3.5, and 3, whatever. So you know the netted amount, you know the OIS rate, you want to find out present value. So present value equals netted amount multiplied by exponential function, negative sign, interest rate times time. Okay, so 0 because the swap is starting right now, so 0 0. If you then drag it, it is minus 4947, minus 7278, minus 2382, 4680, so on and so forth. Always value of a swap is addition of all present values. So if you add them up, it gives you 14526. So value of this swap is 14526. So this is how you calculate value of a swap. Valuation of swap: discount at risk-free OIS rate, the netted amount, and add all cash flows. The next concept is currency swaps. So difference between currency swaps is, in interest rate swaps, you do not exchange principals at the start and at the end. But since currency swaps are in different currencies, you generally exchange principal at the start and at the end. Okay. Okay. So let's discuss currency swaps. So currency swaps, the difference between interest rate swaps and currency swaps, the principals are exchanged at the beginning and at the end. So we'll take an example and try to understand them. So assume that, it's not assumption, Shopify is a Canadian company, Amazon is an American company. Shopify wants to expand in United States, and it requires 100 million US dollars to expand into United States. Amazon wants to expand further into Canada, and which it requires 130 million dollars in Canadian terms, 130 million Canadian, to expand into Canada. Now Shopify is a Canadian company, so it will have a better rate in Canada in terms of borrowing. Amazon is an American company, so it will have better rates in US in terms of borrowing, because banks generally favor domestic companies instead of foreign institutions. So what is happening with Shopify? Shopify can borrow at 4% in United States versus 3% that Amazon can borrow. So Shopify, who wants US dollars, if it borrows in United States, it can borrow US dollars at 4%, right? Amazon can borrow in United States at 3%. So it can borrow USD at 3% because it's an American company. Banks generally favor it, so the rate is lower. But Shopify is a Canadian company, so it will have certain benefits in Canada. So in Canada, it can borrow at 2%, while Amazon can borrow money in Canada at 3.5%. So what is happening? One country needs money in US dollars, other country requires money in Canadian dollars. The country that requires USD has unfavorable rates because it's not a domestic company. A company that requires Canadian dollars also has unfavorable rate because it is not a Canadian company. So what they can do? Shopify can borrow on behalf of Amazon. Amazon can borrow on behalf of Shopify and exchange the cash flows. So assume principal is $100 million. Currency swap exchange rate is 1.3. So 100 million USD equals 130 million Canadian dollars. So what will Shopify do? So to take advantage of favorable rates, Shopify will borrow $130 million Canadian and give it to Amazon because it has favorable rates in Canada. And Amazon, not Shopify, Amazon will borrow 100 million USDs in American system and give it to Shopify. So Shopify gets US dollars 100 million from Amazon. It can expand into US. Amazon gets 130 million Canadian from Shopify. It can expand into Canada. Both of them get favorable rate. Now this is a typical example of swap. So how will the currency swap work? In currency swap, both will exchange principals. Shopify will give 130 million and receive 100 million, 130 Canadian, 100 American. Amazon will give 100 American and get back 130 Canadian. And once the swap starts working, once the swap starts performing, what will Shopify do? Shopify will receive interest rate of 2% on 130 million Canadian from Amazon, and it will pay 3% on 100 million USD to Amazon. So in a swap, Shopify will receive 2% on 130 million Canadian that it has to pay on the borrowing that it has taken, and it will pay 3% on 100 million USD that it has to do. So in a swap agreement, Shopify will receive 2% on 130 million Canadian dollars and it will pay 3% on 100 million US dollars. Same way, Amazon will receive 3% on USD from Shopify and it will pay 2% on Canadian dollars towards Shopify. So it receives 2% on 130 million from Amazon and it pays 3% on 100 million to Amazon. This Amazon player receives 3% on 100 million USD from Shopify and it pays 2% on 130 million to Shopify. So effectively both of them, so Amazon ended up borrowing at 2% and Shopify ended up borrowing at 3%. So they did not get unfavorable rates. So let's see how this flow would work for Shopify and for Amazon across 5 years. So assume it is a 5-year swap, right? So let's do it for Shopify and let's do it for Amazon so that you understand better. So Shopify, initially it pays 100 million, it pays 130 million USD into the swap to Amazon and it receives 100 million USD from the swap. Okay, this is happening at time 0. Amazon same way pays 100 million USD and it receives 130 million CAD, Canadian dollars. So this was time 0. Principal is exchanged at the beginning. Then interest is paid or received. And at the end, again, principals are exchanged. So let's see what happens. Year 1, Shopify will pay interest 2% on 130 million. So 2% on 130 million Canadian dollars it will receive. It receives it. So receives is positive. So 2%. 2% on 130 million. Okay. each period it will receive $260,000, right, Canadian from Amazon. So 2.6 million each year it will receive from Amazon, and it will pay so I'm highlighting this as green. So green is Canadian. Okay, and it pays 3% into 100 million on USD. Okay, so what is happening for Shopify from the swap? The cash flows are, it receives 2.6 million from Amazon and it pays 3 million to Amazon. Okay, yeah, perfect. For Amazon it receives 3% on 100 million. Okay, so this was USD, and it pays 2% on 130 million. This was Canadian dollars. Okay, this is how the swap would work. First, exchange the principal. Shopify pays 130 million, receives 100 million USD. Amazon pays 100 million USD, receives 130 million. Now Amazon will keep on paying $2.6 million Canadian to Shopify and keep on receiving 3 million American from Shopify. Shopify will keep on receiving 2.6 million Canadian from Amazon, and it will keep on paying 3 million USD to Amazon. At the end of 5 years, they again exchange the principal. So Shopify will pay 100 million back to Amazon, and it will receive 130 million Canadian from Amazon. Same way, Amazon will pay 130 million CAD and it will receive 100 million USD. So how would a currency swap works? At time 0, principals are exchanged, then interest is paid. You have to remember this example to understand who pays what interest. It's little tricky to understand, right? So who pays and who receives, who pays and who receives, and finally when the swap ends in the 5th year, right, again principals are exchanged. Okay, now how does valuation of swap work? For valuation of swap, you discount Canadian cash flows by the risk-free rate in Canada, and you discount US cash flows by risk-free rate in United States, and then use this formula. Value of swap is BD minus S0 into BF. So I'll give you an example. Let's take this example. So I'll copy this somewhere else and let's calculate value of a currency swap. So first of all, you need exchange rate, right, in terms of US dollars. So 1 Canadian dollar equals to 1 divided by 3 US dollars. So the exchange rate is 1.1 divided by 1.3, not 1.3. So 1 Canadian dollar is 0.7692 US dollars. So how do you value a swap? You find out present values. So for this, let's do 130 million. Okay. And 100 million. One more zero. Okay. How do you find value of a swap? You discount these highlighted cash flows by US risk free, and you discount these highlighted cash flows by Canadian risk free. So let's say risk free rate in Canada RF, risk free rate in United States R is 2%, and the risk free rate in Canadian dollars RF is, let's say, 3%. So what do? You find present value of US dollars and present value of Canadian dollars using the respective risk free rates. So let's do that. So it is present value. No, we don't do present value, we discount it, right? So we always use exponential in derivatives. So 3 million, the risk free rate, the cash flow, multiplied by exponential, negative sign for discounting, 2% is the risk free rate into time. Second cash flow, exponential, negative sign for discounting, 2% into time, multiply this by cash flow. So I'll just drag it down. Okay, so these are present values in USD. So if you add them up, it will be 104 million USD, right? Same way we'll do it for Canadian dollars. So these greens are Canadian dollars. So it will be cash flow multiplied by exponential, negative sign, 3% now because Canadian dollars risk free is 3% into time 1. Next it is cash flow multiplied by exponential, negative sign, 3% into time. Just drag it down. Okay, and add them up. So you know what is present value of cash flows in US dollars and what is present value of cash flows in Canadian dollars. Now what do? You use this formula. Formula is present value in US dollars minus exchange rate into Canadian dollars. Once again, present value in US dollars that we calculated by discounting these, and risk free rate to in minus the conversion rate right now, spot rate right now, right, 0.7692 into present value of Canadian dollars using risk-free thus. So value of this swap right now is $9 million. Value of this swap right now is $9 million. So I'll go back to slide. Valuation of currency swap is done in 2 steps. Step 1, calculate present value of cash flows in dollars using risk-free rate in dollars. Calculate present value of foreign currency, right, using risk-free rate of foreign currency. Then use the formula present value of dollars minus conversion rate into present value in foreign currency. So those things were important. What is a swap? What is an interest rate swap? How to calculate value of an swap? What is a currency swap? How to calculate value of a currency swap? So let's go to presentation and try and complete the chapter. So chapter 7, swaps. So what is a swap? Swap is an agreement to exchange cash flow at specified future times according to a specific rule. An example of a interest rate swap, an agreement by an Apple to receive 6 months LIBOR and pay a fixed rate of 5% per annum every 6 months for 3 years on a notional principal of 100 million. Next slide illustrates the cash flow. So what is Apple doing? Apple is converting its fixed rate. So it is paying fixed and receiving floating. So it is converting its fixed rate into floating. So how will it work? So cash flows to Apple. So if LIBOR is 4.2%, it will pay fixed of 5% divided by 2, so 2.5%, and it will receive floating of 2.1. So net cash flows they have calculated 0.4 million, 0.1 million, 0.15 million, 0.25 million, 0.3 million, 0.45 million. So whatever floating cash flow is there, you need to calculate that. Whatever cash flow is there, fixed cash flow is there, you need to consider that and then calculate the net cash flows. One important thing in swaps, the rate are decided at the start of the period, but rates are paid at the end of the period. So it's a 6-month obligation. So rate is decided at the beginning of 6 months, but rate is paid at the end of 6 months. So March 8th, the rate would be decided 4.2, but it will be paid on September 8th. September 8th, the rate whichever is decided will be paid on March. March, whatever rate is decided will be paid on September. Then September rate paid in March. March rate paid in September. September rate paid in March. Okay. Typical use of an interest rate swap, converting an liability. So how to consider converting an liability. So Amazon and Walmart example. You can convert fixed rate to a floating rate or a floating rate to a fixed rate, or you can convert an investment, an asset, fixed rate to floating rate or floating rate to fixed. So they have given an example of Citi. So Citi and Apple can get into an agreement. Apple pays fixed, Citi pays LIBOR, right? So converting interest rate swap between Apple and Citigroup. Then Apple transforms a liability from floating to fixed. So it will convert. So it has to pay floating rates, right? So it will pay fixed to Citi, get a floating from LIBOR and use that LIBOR to pay off its obligation. Okay. We have discussed this in the banking example. We are converting liabilities. So not the banking example, the Walmart example. So go back and refer to that. Interest rate swap between Citi and Intel. So Citi can get into agreement where it pays fixed, receives floating, right? Then Intel can use that fixed rate to pay off its floating rate. Pay off its fixed obligation. So we have considered in detail. We have also done some problems. Same way they are given another swap example where Apple can transform an asset. So asset pays you. So the bank example. So RBC was getting a fixed rate. So it will pay that fixed rate to Citi and get back LIBOR. So it is converting an asset that pays fixed into a floating rate. Same way Intel is TD was getting a floating rate, it is paying floating, getting fixed from RBC. Okay. So we have discussed like swaps are considered by using swap option makers. So what is a swap option maker? It's a financial institutions will generally offer bid and offer prices and swap rates. So it will try to collect money from the swap using spreads. Now day count is important, right? If you look at the book and problems, day count is important because LIBOR follows a convention. We have discussed it in last class. Like LIBOR follows a convention of actual by 360. So whenever you're calculating interest rates, we use this convention actual by 360 in US because LIBOR is money market rate. Now, whenever you get into a swap transaction, you get a confirmation. So confirmation specify the terms of the transaction. There is a body called as International Swaps and Derivatives Organization that has developed master agreements that are like blueprints that each company can use to make bilateral agreements. Most of the time, a central party is used for standard swaps. Then we have discussed this. There are comparative advantages. Some companies can borrow better, right, in certain markets. We discussed it in an example of a currency swap. So Shopify had benefit of borrowing at a lower rate in Canada, and Amazon had benefit of borrowing at a lower rate in United States. So they can use their comparative advantages to get into a transaction. Okay, so they have given an example. You can read it from the book. Criticisms is there is a reason why a company can borrow at a lower rate. Maybe the tax considerations are important, right? And all other factors are important. So whenever you're getting into a swap transaction, you have to remember those. Valuation of interest rate swaps. Initial interest rate swaps are worth, means initially when a swap is initiated, the value is 0. But at later times, you have to calculate LIBOR forward rate. So generally forward rates are given to you. If not, we have discussed how to calculate LIBOR's forward rate. Then calculate cash flows that occur, so net values that would occur, and discount those net values by OIS rate, right? Risk-free rate. So effectively you have to calculate cash flows that the swap is going to pay, then use those cash flows and discount it at risk-free OIS rate. They have given an example. A swap paying 3% per annum receives LIBOR every 6 months on 100 million. Swap has 15 months remaining. Exchange is going to happen in 3, 9, 15 months. LIBOR rate applicable to exchange in 3 months was determined 3 months ago at 2.9. Forward LIBOR rates are for 3 to 9 months and 9 to 15 months are 2.429, 3.739. OIS rates for maturity 3, 9, 15 are 2.8, 3.2 and 4.6. So swap rates are nothing but LIBOR rates. So LIBOR rate is a floating rate, right? And risk-free rate is nothing but OIS rate. So how to do that? So first of all, 0.25, 0.75 and 1.25, this is the time period. Now fixed cash flow is fixed rate 3% per annum divided by 2 because it is semi-annual, right? And 100 million principal, so it is 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. Floating rate is calculating using LIBOR. So we know 2.9 is the first LIBOR, so 2.9 divided by 2 into 100 million. Next LIBOR is 3.429, so 3.429 divided by 2 into 100 million, and the last LIBOR is 3.734, so 3.734 divided by 2 multiplied by 100 million. So you got the floating cash flows. Calculate the net cash flows, then discount these cash flows using continuous compounding and risk-free rate of 2.8, 3.2 and 3.4, right? Calculate the present values and add them up. That is the value of swap. Okay, so bootstrapping 6, 12, 18 months and 24 months OIS rate are 3.8, 4.3, 4.6, 4.75. 6 months LIBOR rate is 4%. Suppose a forward LIBOR rate for 6 to 12, 12 to 18 months has already been computed as 5 and 5.5. So, and a 2-year swap rate is known. So you can calculate LIBOR forward for 18 to 9 months period. So how to do that? A 2-year swap with 5% is paid and LIBOR is received is worth 0. So value is 0. So 0.5 into difference between the LIBOR rates, then discounted at risk-free rates. Difference between LIBOR discounted at one period, risk-free rate, you calculate the value. The fourth value must be 0.25 so that the value is same. So you put it in the equation and try to find LIBOR rate. So if LIBOR rate are not given, you can reverse calculate this mechanism to find LIBOR rate in this period. So that is bootstrapping. An example of a fixed for currency swap. So they are going to currency swaps now. Currency swaps is where you exchange principal at the beginning, then interest payments are exchanged, then at the end principals are exchanged back. So they have given an example. Exchange of principal in an interest rate swap, the principal is not exchanged. In a currency swap, the principal is exchanged at the beginning and at the end, right? So they have given an example. So principal is exchanged, right? You pay foreign currency, you get domestic currency, or you pay domestic currency, you receive foreign currency, whatever. You pay interest, you exchange the principal at the end. Typical use of currency swaps: conversion from liability in one currency to a liability in other currency, conversion of investment in one currency to investment in other currency. Comparative advantages may be real because of taxes. So General Motors wants to borrow in Australian dollars. Qantas, which is an Australian company, wants to borrow in US dollars. So General Electric will get a better rate in USD than Qantas gets. Qantas gets a better rate in AUD than what General Electric gets. So both of them can exchange, can use swaps to get better rates for each of them. Okay, so they have given an example of Japanese and US currency swaps. So dollars cash flow, yen's cash flow. This is valuation of currency swaps. So how to value currency swaps? We follow an easier method than what's given in the book, right? Calculate cash flows in US dollars, calculate cash flows in foreign currency, discount the US dollars by using US dollar rate, discount the cash flows in foreign currency using foreign currency rate, add them up, and we use that formula. So that formula is given somewhere. They have used a more complex method. So the formula was in the Excel sheet: BD minus S0 BF. This is an easier way to do it than what's given in the book. There are other currency swaps. Currency swaps depend on your imagination. Financial engineering has increased the amount of swaps that are there. So there are many variations of swaps, but swap is nothing but exchanging one cash flow for other. So there are fixed for floating, equivalent to a fixed for fixed currency swap. So you get fixed rate, you convert it to floating. You get floating rate, you convert it to fixed. There is floating for floating. So floating rate on treasury can be exchanged for floating rate on, let's say, corporate bonds. So you can do floating for floating. Swap can also be regarded as a convenient package of forward contracts. When a swap is initiated, the swap has zero value, but typically some forwards have positive value and some forwards will have negative value. Swaps generally carry credit risk because if the other party is making loss, and if the other party is making a loss, and if he or her defaults on his obligations, then the party who is making profits will have credit risk. When derivative transactions with the counterparty are cleared bilaterally, they are netted. There is exposure if net value outstanding is greater than collateral possessed. Credit default swaps. So credit default swaps we are going to discuss in future chapters too, But what is a credit default swap? It is like an insurance. So you can buy credit default swaps on any company or any bond. So credit default swap is where you pay an insurance premium and the insurance company will pay you if the company defaults. Example, RBC has $100 million worth of bonds. I am afraid of losing money on those bonds. So I can take an insurance on those $100 million worth of bonds. If RBC defaults, that insurance company will pay me whatever loss I am making in those bonds. But if RBC doesn't default, then my premium is gone. So notional principal 100 million, maturity 5 years, protection, buyer pays a fixed rate on a notional principal. So if the reference entity, it can be country, company, bond, right? It defaults, then the insurance company would pay. There are many different other types of swaps. There is an amortization swap which works on an, so you can exchange mortgages. So you have a mortgage, someone else has a mortgage, you can exchange your mortgage principals and mortgage payments. That's an amortization swap. Compounding swap, in which compounding rates are calculated and paid at the end. Constant maturity swap, so it is like a bond. LIBOR in arrears swap, right? Accrual swap. Equity swaps we are going to discuss in future slides. You can convert your equity portfolio into bond portfolio, and you can convert a bond portfolio into equity portfolio. So you exchange returns on an equity portfolio with bond portfolio, and bond portfolio will exchange returns on equity for its bond returns. So you can convert bond to stocks, stocks to bond using a swap. Okay. Other types: cross currency interest rate swap, floating for floating currency swaps, different swaps, commodity swaps, variance swaps. So these are all complex topics. You need to know that there are many different types of swaps. Financial engineering has increased the variations and like the types of swaps that are there, but like those are variance swaps is extremely detailed, so it's not there, but you need to know that there are different types of swap. And that completes chapter 7. I'll urge you to at least see the recording twice, especially for the Excel part. It is a little bit difficult to understand.